He's a professor at the University of Sydney. Please put my hands together in welcoming Professor Salvatore Babones.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. I know that today is Hindu Advocacy Day, but I am going to talk today about Muslims. On June 22nd, here in Washington, the Wall Street Journal reporter Sabrina Siddiqui was given a fantastic opportunity to put questions to Joe Biden and Narendra Modi. She was one of only two journalists given this opportunity. Now, she works for a business newspaper, the Wall Street Journal. You'd think she might ask them about investment partnerships, about technology development, about potential, maybe there's going to be a trade deal in the works someday. But no, she asked President Biden, she said the U.S., she suggested that the United States is overlooking the targeting of religious minorities in India, and asked the president why he was doing that. He sidestepped the question, said that, well, India's democracy is India's business and we won't interfere. She asked Prime Minister Modi what steps India was taking to, quote, improve the rights of Muslims in India. And of course, he sidestepped the question. I mean, because these were not questions, these were virtue signals. The Wall Street Journal wasted its only opportunity, and it was the only United States newspaper to be given the opportunity to question Joe Biden and Narendra Modi, and it wasted it on a virtue signal of having a reporter publicly demonstrate the newspaper's commitment to human rights for Muslims in India. Well, I'm an academic. I'm a liberal academic. I believe in human rights. I'm also concerned about the human rights of Muslims in India, and so I've done some research on it. Now, it's not only my research. Most of these data will come from the Pew Research Center just up the road here in Washington, D.C. The Pew Research Center is, I think it's safe to say, the world's most respected survey research organization. It is eminently reputable. There is no question about Pew's methods. In fact, Pew did a survey of 29,999. People ask me why it wasn't 30,000. I'm sure they budgeted for 30,000. They got 29,999 households in India in a survey in 2019, 2020, just before COVID hit. It was a nationally representative survey. Only a few districts that were involved in active insurgencies were excluded from the survey. So over 99% of the Indian population was represented. It was probably the best social survey ever conducted in India. The response rate was over 85%. It was a knock-on-the-door survey, not a telephone survey, so there's no question of biases being introduced by sampling or poor sampling practice. This was a gold-plated survey, platinum-plated survey. And what's more, it was funded by the Sir John Templeton Foundation, which is, the criticisms of the foundation is that it supports Christian missionary causes. Whether those criticisms are earned or not, certainly the Sir John Templeton Foundation is not known as a pro-India or pro-Hindu organization. Right? This is simply the best data we have about religion in India. What did they find? 24% of Muslims, when surveyed, said that Muslims face discrimination in India. Now, we don't ask people, do you face discrimination? Because that's very confronting. We want people to feel they can honestly answer the question. So instead we ask, and again, royal we, survey researchers, ask them, do people like you face discrimination? So 24% of Muslims said that Muslims face discrimination in India. Well, is that bad? I mean, 1/4 sounds bad, But I'm a comparative social scientist. Everything I do involves quantitative international comparisons. I wrote the book on quantitative international comparisons. So if we want to know how good or bad that is, we have to have some benchmarks. And luckily we do have benchmarks. Pew conducted a survey with the same question, with the same wording in the United States, and found that 80% of African Americans say that African Americans face discrimination. 46% of Hispanic Americans say that Hispanic Americans face discrimination, and 42% of Asian Americans say that Asian Americans face discrimination in America. In India, it was 24% of Muslims say they face discrimination, and for other religious groups, a range between 21 and 24%. In other words, Asians in India say they face about half as much discrimination as when they migrate to the United States. Okay, so that's very low. 98% of India's Muslims say they're free to practice their religion in India. So 2% saying they're not free. In survey research, that's about as close to 100% as you ever get. If you, and I don't say this to be facetious, I mean, if you literally asked, is the United States government controlled by a Martian cabal from outer space that has mind control lasers, you would get 2% of Americans saying yes. Okay. Because 2% is just how many people click the wrong box accidentally. Just because they misread the question. Did you mean free or not free? And they hit the wrong box. That's 2%. How many people just didn't hear the question? That's 2%. So 2% is nothing. India's Muslims, almost to a person, say they're free to practice their religion in India. And similar percentages of Christians, Sikhs, Hindus, and other groups in India. 99% of India's Muslims say they are proud to be Indian. The whole narrative that Indian Muslims, and this is again an ultra right-wing, ultra fringe movement in India, that India's Muslims are somehow fifth columnists who want to betray the country. They're secret Pakistani spies. They don't want India. They want to break up India. The PFI people. So there's a small group in India, the Popular Front of India, which probably is a few dozen people, maybe at most a few hundred people in the whole country. Yes, those are, there are Muslims in the PFI who are anti-Indian, but everyone else, 99% of India's Muslims, say they're proud to be Indian. Okay. When Muslims are asked, what are the top problems facing India, and they're given 4 choices, they can't choose anything they want, they're given 4 choices. They rank them: number 1, unemployment; number 2, corruption; number 3, crime; number 4, intercommunal violence. Those were the 4 choices given. They couldn't put intercommunal violence any lower because they're only given 4 choices. Okay, that's all from the Pew survey. More broadly, India's Muslims have higher income than Hindus in India. Roughly 20 million Muslims, at least that's the estimate, the official estimate from the government, roughly 20 million Muslims have fled Bangladesh into India. Now, even if that's an overestimate, and it's only 10 million, compare that to how many Indian Hindus have fled India into Bangladesh. 0. How many Indian Muslim refugee applications do Bangladesh and Pakistan get? 0 or essentially 0. The motion is all in the other direction. In other words, South Asian Muslims continue to migrate into India, particularly from Bangladesh, not the other way around. So much so that it's become controversial in India with the Citizenship Amendment Act not granting automatic refugee status to Muslims because of the argument that Muslims from Bangladesh are clearly not fleeing Bangladesh because of religious persecution, because they're Muslim. Where are they going in India? They're going to 2 states, primarily West Bengal and Assam, that are poorer than the national average in India and are poorer than Bangladesh. Bangladesh has virtually the same GDP per capita as India, give or take. I mean, every year it's a few percentage points either way. But West Bengal is a relatively poor state in India. Assam is a very poor state in India. So we have the situation where Bangladeshi Muslims are fleeing Bangladesh into India, not for economic opportunity, because ceteris paribus, all things equal, economic opportunities are better in Bangladesh than they are in Assam, but because for whatever reason, they feel more comfortable or more desirous of living in India than of living in Bangladesh. Okay. Yet last year, the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, again, a very highly regarded institution, rated India at the second highest risk of a mass killing in the world. Okay, second highest, people say colloquially, genocide risk. They don't say that on their website, they say mass killing, but it's the Holocaust Museum and they're talking about genocide risk. And that was very widely reported. They don't mention that the number one genocide risk is Pakistan. No one bothers about that. We get very bothered about the fact that India was named number 2 for genocide risk. So how is this possible? Right? I mean, how are these statistics commensurate? And the answer is that there is a gross manipulation of the narrative on Indian Muslims. And I always stress, and I insist on this to everybody, that gross manipulation does not originate in India. It originates in Doha, it originates in Riyadh, it originates in the United States, over the river in Northern Virginia. It does not come out of India. 99% of Indian Muslims say they're proud to be Indian. This is an international Islamist narrative. And that narrative has been manipulating the data and presenting the data torturing the data in ways to try to build any kind of message they can to attack India on behalf of Indian Muslims who are not asking for international Islamists to act on their behalf. Now, when you spend, I've spent the last 3 years researching this book on Indian democracy. When you read not one article about allegations of human rights abuses, when you read 20, 30, 50, 100 articles, you start seeing the same patterns, you see the same allegations, the same reports, the same statistics being cherry-picked out of context. But I'll give you just one example. If you look on the web, the difference in incomes between Muslims and Hindus in India, the internet will tell you that Muslims in India have lower income than Hindus. Now, why will the internet tell you that? Because there are about a dozen reports that tell you that. Read the reports carefully, and the categories in all of the reports come from the same Indian data, and they report income for upper caste Hindus, OBC, scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, and Muslim. And in fact, if you look at the upper caste Hindu number, they do make more than Muslims on average, because of course it's an elite subset of the Hindu population in India. It would be like saying that black Americans in the greater DC suburbs earn more than white Americans in Alabama. It would be true, but it would be mendacious. You would be picking a subset. Okay. Yet this is the established narrative, and there's so many reports on it that of course this narrative gets embedded in Wikipedia, it gets embedded in reporting, because people don't carefully read these reports. People pick up the press release for the report, and once it's been picked up and reported in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, on Wikipedia, it simply becomes the truth. Similarly, there are lynchings of Muslims in India. Anyone who says so, I'm sorry, about 50 Muslims a year, give or take. India actually collects systematic data on lynchings. There are about 50 or so a year lynchings of Muslims in India. And there are also about 50 or so a year lynchings of Hindus in India, which is to say that in very poor areas of India, there is intercommunal violence, and there is lynching on both sides of this intercommunal violence. 100 years terrible. Well, in a US context, if we were to standardize for population size, we were to think about what would this mean, that might come down to 20 killings a year. In other words, a month in Chicago. It's not good. I don't endorse it, and I don't mean to make fun of it. I simply mean to contextualize it. That there is a problem. It's a problem that Indian governments should address. But it's pretty much an even-handed problem. It's a problem that needs to be addressed on both sides. And among the problems faced by India, international terrorism, poverty, hunger, it may not always be the top-ranked problem. There are high levels of residential segregation in India. Again, the reports have mendaciously reported this as if it were like the United States. In the United States, residential segregation of African Americans and other Americans is largely the legacy of structurally racist practices that go back to the Jim Crow era and before, go back to slavery. I mean, covenants and leases from 50, 100 years ago that prohibited blacks from living in particular neighborhoods. I mean, residential segregation in the United States is a legacy of racism. Whether or not it reflects present-day racism, it is a legacy of racism. But we could just as well compare the residential segregation of Hindus and Muslims in India to the segregation of Christians and Jews in the United States. Most American Jews live in Jewish communities. They don't live equally spread around the country. They live in areas where they can access synagogues, where there are other Jews, where there are Jewish services, where there are stores and restaurants that cater to Jewish interests. And that's perfectly natural. Now, we can weaponize these statistics. We can say that, we can find a stat that shows Muslims having lower income. We can find a stat about 50 lynchings of Muslims. We can find a stat about residential segregation, and we can weaponize it. I'm here neither to weaponize it nor to excuse it. I'd like to contextualize these data. Let's have an accurate view of what's actually going on. Okay, speaking as a comparative social scientist who has no horse in these races. I'm not Hindu, I'm not Muslim, I'm not being paid by anybody. I wasn't paid to be here today. My expenses were paid, but I contributed my time for free. As someone who just has no horse at all in these races, I'd like to tell you honestly, there is a problem of social exclusion of Muslims in Hindu-majority India. There is a problem with social exclusion of Muslims in India. I was speaking at the India Today conclave, and I was asked about this by Rajiv Sardesai, the India Today journalist. He said Muslims are 15% of India's population, but only 5% of the Lok Sabha, India's parliament. And I said, yes, you're right. How many Muslims are here at the India Today conclave? Because I'd been there 3 days, and I only met one. Now, that's not because India Today is an anti-Muslim organization. That's because there is social exclusion of Muslims in peak-level Indian institutions, and that's something that India should be working on. That's something they should work hard to be more inclusive, to bring Muslim voices into majority Hindu organizations like India Today, like the Lok Sabha, all levels of politics and governance in India. Look, this social exclusion is largely due to the persistence of parallel societies of Hindus and Muslims in India. That's a legacy of partition that goes all the way back to 1947, and the Jinnah's Muslim League demands that Hindus and Muslims could not live in the same society. He insisted there had to be parallel societies for Hindus and Muslims, and of course he got that in the creation of Pakistan and Bangladesh. The challenge for India is to bring India's Muslims back into Indian society as they were before 1947, and as we all hope they will be in the 21st century. Thank you.